Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, here in Washington, D.C., hosting a approximately 30-minute conversation with scholars and friends about the work of the late, great Theodore Weber, who taught Christian ethics at Candler School of Theology at Emory University for many, many years and wrote what is possibly the most important book on Methodist political theology. Not that there's a lot of competition, it's a much underdeveloped field. But 30 years ago, he wrote Politics in the Order of Salvation, Transforming Wesleyan Political Ethics, which I commend to everyone. The scholars who are part of this conversation include, if I can recall all of them, Jim Thobaben at Asbury Seminary, Jason Vickers at Asbury Seminary, soon to be at Truett Seminary at Baylor University, Dale Coulter down at Pentecostal Seminary in East Tennessee, our own Ryan Danker of the John Wesley Institute, and Stephen Rankin, the former chaplain at Southern Methodist University. Now, Steve, pastoring a church in Kansas, correct?
Correct.
5 distinguished men who are familiar with the work of Ted Weber. Jim Thobaben actually studied under Ted Weber. Jim, maybe we'll start with you. What are your impressions and memories of Dr. Weber, and what were his unique contributions, especially to a Wesleyan understanding of Christian political theology?
Well, first of all, thanks for hosting us, Mark. I have 2 clear memories, and they're purely anecdotal. They don't do anything but, as the saying goes, they don't demonstrate, but they illustrate. So it's worth mentioning them. I was really strongly influenced by Anabaptist thought because of where I grew up and because of my own family background. And Ted was having none of that, I got to tell you. So, I mean, when I went to class and suggested something along the lines of what would now be called the Benedict option, he said, that isn't an acceptable position for a Methodist to hold. Well, we went back and forth a little bit. Ted always knew the material, that's for sure. My other anecdote with Ted was when I presented my dissertation, I had 2 advisors, one in ethics and one in sociology of religion because of my topic. And Ted's first comment in my defense, this is my dissertation defense. He looked at me and then he looked at the other advisor I had, the sociology advisor I had, and he said, why in the world should we even consider this for a religion PhD? And they argued for 20 minutes. Then after they got tired, I defended my dissertation for about 10 minutes and everybody stood and congratulated me and said, I could call them by their first names now. And Ted was just as happy and as pleasant as he could be after that. But I wondered when that conversation started off if he was going to let my dissertation go through. He was just a smidge of a curmudgeon.
Good for him.
Well, that's a good memory of his personality. In terms of what he taught, he had a unique insight on Wesley's view and a wider Wesleyan view, which I guess aren't necessarily the same, of the political image of God, which has a tremendous impact on how Methodism affects society across the last 250 years. But the way Weber interprets this Wesleyan political image of God, it confers a political authority upon each individual. This political image is corrupted by the fall, but not erased by the fall. And this duty and responsibility conferred upon each individual ultimately has a very, I would say, egalitarian and democratic influence on how Methodists operate in society, which Weber contrasts with Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther, and even with Karl Barth. Interestingly, he says Karl Barth and his followers have a very narrowly Christocentric view of the political image of God that focuses on the the Sermon on the Mount as the be-all, end-all of Christian political and social witness. But the Wesleyan view is much more little c Catholic, the Trinitarian view of the political image of God, and much fuller orbed in terms of how Christians operate in society. That's my brief synopsis of his perspective, but your all's thoughts.
I think that's accurate. I mean, one of the things that I do remember from class, and I just reread his big tome, is that he was a very good and honest analyst of Wesley. And what I mean by that is he saw Wesley's strengths, but he admitted Wesley's, I won't say weaknesses, I'll call it inconsistencies. And he absolutely believed that Wesley's understanding of political engagement was a little off from his more, as you put it, egalitarian theology, especially the notion of prevenient grace. Well, really also in his ecclesiology with the way he elevated people out of the working class into leadership.
And I think he makes the case that a Wesleyan political theology is in many ways more optimistic than the Lutheran Reformed alternatives, in that Martin Luther would have seen government as grimly just to restrain the most gross forms of evil, whereas a Wesleyan perspective sees government more cheerfully, as Weber puts it, drawn from the knowledge of the work of God and not from the problem that humankind has become. Thoughts?
I'll throw one more thing and then I'll be quiet for a while and let this better scholars. The reason I'm speaking first is I want to say my incorrect things, or the few things I actually know, and get them out before anybody else lays claim to them, because these are all really better Wesley scholars than I. I agree with you, Jim. I will say this, I think, and I don't remember Ted dealing with this particular issue. When Methodism came to America, if I can use Trumpian language, it was a sect inside a state church. And then because of the revolution, the state church disappeared. So it was sectarian. And that sectarian movement was strongly perfectionist. And I know Charles Finney wasn't technically a Methodist, but he was caught up in that same kind of argument. And that perfectionism merged with American notions of progress into an optimism that was excessive. So that's the only place I'm not disagreeing with you, Jim. I'm just pushing back a little bit. I think Wesley needed to, and maybe he did, and these other folks can tell us, he needed to have restraint on his optimism about what was actually ever going to be possible with perfection in society, because it really did move toward a theocratic argument in Charles Finney.
Jason, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I came, if I can kind of backtrack for just a moment. I mean, I came to Weber while working on Wesley, around 2008, 2009, somewhere in there, and working on his politics as they relate to his theology, his life, and trying to make sense out of how, you know, someone could say, you know, you can't love God if you don't also love the king, you know, that kind of move. It struck me as something about Wesley that in the American context today, we don't take very seriously, don't think about, don't talk about. And I found in Weber someone that took all of that quite seriously. But I wound up sort of backtracking a little bit to investigate how Wesley himself had been read in the past by older scholars, you know, Henson, Simmel, people like this. And, you know, for a long time, he was sort of a high church Tory, right? And then this sort of, you kind of had a two-stage theory develop that he goes from that into a more Whiggish kind of mode. What I saw in Weber that made sense to me was he said, look, no, he still has strong Tory, you know, high church sentiments. He still has divine right. It's just not hereditary. And he's a constitutionalist. And then what I really liked in Weber's work was how much he pressed the constitutionalist aspect of Wesley's political philosophy. as well as the concept of liberty rather than rights, a liberty that comes with responsibility to obey. So that, and then just sort of rounding this off, I mean, what I found in Weber was a vision of Wesley's politics that wanted to avoid kind of two things, at least in terms of Wesley. Wesley wanted to avoid, Wesley wants to avoid two things at the same time. At one end of the spectrum, the mob, right? Anarchy. At the other end of the spectrum, absolute power, right? That's not checked by the Constitution. So Weber gives you a sort of vision of Wesley that doesn't give you a divine monarchy that is a form of absolute power that can turn against you, right? But on the other hand, you're not developing some kind of notion of natural rights that can evolve in a way that leads to a kind of mob situation. So obedience is important. Obedience to king and constitution. The king's power is limited by the Constitution. But you can forfeit your liberties. You can forfeit civil and religious liberties if you don't obey. These things are not unconditional. I thought all of that actually melded well with what I kind of think of as his covenantal Arminianism. You know, that the terms of salvation are covenanted. You have a role, if you will, you have a responsibility in terms of salvation. Where I'll just say this, round off my kind of intro remarks, where I found myself disagreeing or not as convinced by Weber is I think when he gets to when he actually turns from Wesley's politics to Wesley's theology, I think he has some reservations about whether Wesley's understanding of the Trinity in particular is problematic. And I actually think that Weber, if I can say so without being condescending at all, I think he gets a little out of his depth at that point. I don't find his doctrine of the Trinity, Wesley's Trinitarian theology or Trinitarian theology in general to be a problem with respect to his particular political vision. I think they actually go together better than Weber did.
Interesting. Maybe we can get back to that. But first, I want to ask Dale Coulter. Weber, as I mentioned, contrasts the Wesleyan perspective with a Thomistic natural law tradition perspective that derives government from the social and rational character of human nature. But according to Weber, Wesley's idea of government is not so anthropological, but is based more directly on Trinitarian divine agency and through a notion of nature infused by divine grace. Now, Dale, you wrote a piece for our publication Providence on this very notion that the Wesleyan perspective on nature infused by divine grace has political ramifications. Could you explain?
Yeah, so again, as Jason said a few moments ago, with a little fear and trembling, maybe with respect to all that Weber's done, because I do have a tremendous respect for what he's done in this book. I didn't really agree with how he was reading Wesley on natural law, and that's because he just puts up Thomas. And, I have to say, generally speaking, people who haven't invested deep time in the Middle Ages go to Thomas for obvious reasons. I don't think Wesley you can even put him in the Aristotelian Thomistic trajectory of natural law. I think he's following Cicero. He read Cicero. We know this. He quotes from Cicero regularly. When he writes the sermon on the uses of law, when he gives some of his definitions, they're Ciceronian in my view. And it's actually a way of connecting what Wesley is doing in the mid-1700s with what Samuel West does in his 1776 sermon, where he calls for revolution in the colonies, and he talks about natural law in terms of the eternal fittingness of things. He uses the very same phraseology that Wesley had done. It's Ciceronian. And that's the same phraseology that James Wilson, the premier guy lecturing, who gives his lectures on law right at the end of the 1700s, which sort of sets the tone for law in the US. So I think if you put Wesley in a different trajectory, then his natural law position comes out. The other thing for me is I think I disagree with Weber. I think it's kind of a false dichotomy to talk about anthropology and it's not grounded there versus Trinity, because Wesley thinks that the human person is both Christologically formed, and that's where you have to read his natural law bit, and even his sermon on conscience, and also pneumatologically infused. So from the moment we enter life, it's both and, not either or. And Weber doesn't really develop that side. So there's a Trinitarian ground that to the image that then comes through natural law and flows into that. And the last thing I'll just simply say is, I found it interesting that Weber does so much with the political image at the end, which I agree with. I think he's right there. But then he contrasts that with Thomas's view of Aristotelian view that humans are social animals. Well, Aristotle wasn't the only one who said that. You know, Augustine believes that. I mean, there's so many in the patristic tradition that believes that, and it comes through the Middle Ages in a number of different ways. And so I don't see how you can unpack Wesley's notion of humans in the political image and not say the implication is that humans are social animals. God's called them to govern and to, I would call it the cultural mandate out of Genesis 1 and 2, but that's what Wesley's rooting around and thinking through, especially because love is so crucial to Wesley's notion of the image. And I said that was the last thing. Let me say one more quick thing here. Weber at times will act as though Wesley's strong Augustinianism on sin kind of holds in a way that I don't think it holds. I mean, Wesley is really strong on sin, but this is where I wish Weber would have developed more the prevenient grace side, because we're fallen but restored immediately. We're never outside of grace. There is no human person in a state of pure nature. Wesley says that. So on the one hand, yeah, you can affirm that he has a strong Augustinian doctrine of sin. On the other hand, you have to say, but that doesn't matter as much because the Spirit is already there correcting humans from the outset and giving rise to conscience. And conscience is not natural, but supernatural. That is to say, it's grace from the outset. So all of that is to say, I have really great appreciation for Weber. I think he's absolutely correct about we have to have a political language that binds us together, and we don't. And I appreciate the deep historical dive he did to try and give us one. And I think the move that he makes in the last chapter on the political image is the right move, and the move into grace. But having said that, then there's just some things that I would differ with him on how to appropriate Wesley for us today. And that's where I'll stop.
Thank you, Dale. Steve, your thoughts. I know you wrote a very important article about the Wesleyanism and just war teaching. How would you relate that to what Ted Weber has to say?
Well, I think just in direct answer to that question, and I admit I have my own question that I'd like to toss to the group, and so I was kind of focused there. But I think what Weber says about Wesley is consonant with my understanding of Wesley's view of war, and Wesley's doctrine of entire sanctification. Corporately applied and even cosmologically applied. Weber says that Wesley was not a pacifist, and I agree with that. Wesley got his, the closer we get to the image of God fully restored in us, the closer we are to pacifism, is kind of how I read Wesley on that point. And I think that fits with what Weber says. I would like to raise a question that I had about Weber's conclusions, if it's okay to go this direction for a moment. And Mark, I don't want to destroy your plan here, but in that last chapter, Weber mentions, and I got kind of stuck on this quote, the concept of the political vocation of humankind corresponds to Wesley's Arminian doctrine of universal grace, whereas his view of political authority corresponds to Calvinist doctrines of decrees and particular election. This is one of the criticisms that Weber makes of Wesley, and not really, as I understood Weber, he's saying Wesley didn't fully grasp the political implications of his own theological convictions on this point. But I also don't think it's fair of Weber to say that Wesley, in his view of hierarchy, for example, falls back on some sort of Calvinist doctrine of decrees. And I'm just wondering if it's possible to see in Wesley's commitment to a constitutional monarchy, even if that's just, according to the context and the period of time and prudentially adopted and not necessarily a universal thing, that seeing the validity of hierarchy in a Wesleyan Arminian view of political authority worked out doesn't seem as inconsistent to me as Weber took it to be. And I thought his conclusion about Wesley at this point, leaning toward Calvin, was overstated. And I'm just curious what other people thought.
Ryan Danker, your response?
Yeah, I agree with Steve. I don't think it's necessary to go to Calvin or Calvinism for that. I think well, I'll say this about Weber. I love the fact that Weber wrote a book where he didn't, for the most part, I think he was successful in not writing a book about his political thinking and then attaching Wesley's name to it, because we have others who have done that. And he also admits at the beginning that he's an American. He doesn't believe in monarchy, and he's trying to translate this into another context that doesn't have a monarchy. But I think, Steve, you've run into some of the problems that often those of us on this side of the pond run into, because we're generally not monarchists, and Wesley's political theology is built upon his monarchical views. But I think it's not a Calvinism, it's the establishment of an Anglican establishment with the Revolution of 1688, and Wesley's intention to maintain that Protestant Episcopal liturgical heritage, even if it meant limiting monarchy so that you could maintain that. And I think that goes to both, I think it goes to what a number of us have said. Some of us have just referred to it as constitutionalism. Steve, I agree with your critique that it's not Calvinism. It's actually a mature Tory perspective, mainly from the reign of George III. And I think we need to take seriously the fact that Wesley's political writings were predominantly all during the reign of George III, when the Tories came back as a political force after the Whig junta of George I and II. And I think he presents a really good argument for that high church Tory political perspective. And I like the fact that Weber takes that seriously. I'm not sure, like I said, I agree with you, Steve. I'm not sure we need to go to Calvin. I think we can go to 1688 and refer to that as the Anglican Revolution. And that helps us understand Wesley after the accession of George III.
Let me say something real quick here. I agree that it's not Calvin. I think that's right. But, and this goes to an exchange Ryan and I just had by email. I have not figured out how Wesley thinks divine power. He's very clear. Power does not come from the people. Only God can authorize this, and God does. What he's not clear about is actually how God does this. Outside of, he certainly has an understanding of the providential sweep of history, and he will differentiate between God as creator and God as governor. And God as governor then is involved in this. So he says, basically, you can't be the supreme power who wields the sword without receiving the authority to do so. And that authority comes from God. The question is, again, how does God transmit that authority? And Wesley knows enough about history to know that William I, Duke of Normandy, comes across the channel and takes control. and establishes a new monarchy. He knows enough about history to know that monarchies shift. And so what? Is this God providentially now establishing a new monarch? And now that monarch, by virtue of the right of war, has supremacy and is now ruling under God's power and authority? I can't find where he answers that question or the how. I do think this is where, to me, Weber's move at the end into the political image is an important move, because it is certainly one way of answering the how. At minimum, we know that God has granted this power through the image and the political image with respect to humanity. Now, from there, we have to ask, how does that power translate from all humans to particular humans, right? And I don't know that Wesley answers that. My way of getting at a Wesleyan answer that is not distinctive to Wesley is to say, well, what happens in the 1760s when Mary, Fletcher, and Sarah, when they're questioning whether women can preach, and I think they're doing so because of what Fletcher's Pentecostal move on Wesley, the unleashing of the laity, the extraordinary gifts of God, all of this moves in Wesley in a direction of saying, well, God does supernaturally give these gifts to certain people, and they have to be exercised in particular ways. And so this is why one of my questions to Ryan was, does Wesley believe in a sacramental understanding of kingship where at the moment that the person is anointed, from that anointing on, just like holy orders, now the power of God begins to flow in and through the king? Because that view is certainly there in British history, even in recent history. And that would make sense, and that would align more with the idea of extraordinary gifts that Wesley eventually comes to accept later. But, you know, I don't know about all of that, but that would be where I think I push back a little bit on Wesley, and where his political theology is incomplete. And you just have to say with Ryan, well, he's High Church Tory because he's an Englishman. It's like, and he wants to defend that settlement.
Well, but not everybody in England wanted to defend it the same way, and I think we can't say that everybody in England was a Tory, even if they should have been. But yeah, I said that. And for those of you who were not privy to Dale and my email exchanges, I said that we can't underestimate the fact that the second the king or queen dies, then the next king or queen is in fact the monarch. And that hereditary nature is a part of the political situation that Wesley embraced. I think we need to go back to something else that helps us understand British politics.
So
What's that?
That's your claim that Wesley embraced not just monarchy, but hereditary, right?
Under the Anglican Revolution of 1688, that we have to keep that in mind. In his view, if they stepped away from their role to defend the church, then they were essentially giving away their right to the throne.
I'm only raising that because, you know, with respect to Weber, my reading of him, and somewhat operating from memory here, which this might be wrong, you know, is that he actually kind of challenges the idea so he thinks that Wesley is a kind of a Tory that's not tightly wedded to hereditary succession. And so that he quotes Wesley when he says, look, English liberty really begins to thrive with the Glorious Revolution. Right. I mean, so that's which is his evidence that, you know, it's not hereditary succession is not, you know, essential for Wesley. But the maybe just one quick add on there that because this is sort of again the way I was reading Weber, but many years ago. That, you know, part of it is that political parties and sensibilities shift and change. And so the question is whether or not there's some fluidity to Tory identity or or Whig identity, in the 18th century, which kind of can make it, these labels get difficult, to just paste onto Wesley. He's a Tory, he's a Whig, he's a non-juror, he's a Jacobite, he's a whatever. I mean, these things are themselves, there's some fluidity in that century. But that just that one passage stood out to me about the glorious Wesley saying, that never more so than, after following the Glorious Revolution, right? That Englishmen enjoyed liberty. And
Right, but remember what he thought of Catholicism. He believed Catholicism to be anti-liberty. So when he's saying that, he's saying, finally, we have the Protestant establishment that God intended. And those who will defend that are in line with God, ergo. So I think we have to tie all this together, because think of the Ancien regime model of, we've got king, you have church, and you have gentry or parliament. And essentially, he's trying to hold those three together, but the reality is he only sees their validity when they're maintaining what he sees as what God wants, which is a Protestant national church.
But don't you think, I mean, is it the fact that he doesn't go with his mother, right?
Right.
That's what Weber sort of links to. He doesn't hold the hereditary transmission of the monarchy because he would prefer a Protestant. So the Hanoverian, line comes in, and that's preferable because it's Protestant, even though it's a German elector who's coming in, to a Stuart line that would be Catholic, even though the Stuart line might have the better hereditary claim.
But they both have hereditary claim. The question is which one's valid.
Yeah,
It's not like you put anybody on the throne.
which one? Yeah, well, I mean, that's why Weber says Wesley doesn't hold to hereditary monarchy in some strong sense.
Right. And in that case, I agree with Weber. I just think we can't get rid of the term hereditary, because I think then we misunderstand Wesley. But the reality is Weber provided something that was Wesleyan. I think we need to keep that in mind too. He wasn't just talking about Wesley.
Yes.
Right, so
Jim, let me ask you this question. The way Weber portrays it, Wesleyan political theology is distinct from John Wesley and takes us in directions that John Wesley would not have foreseen and maybe not even have approved in terms of its ultimate egalitarian political impact. Do you agree with that interpretation?
Absolutely, and I don't think there's any choice. Because let's assume Ryan is correct, which admittedly is a big assumption.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks.
Well, what happens when the sect is no longer part of a state church? Well, I mean, and furthermore, what happens in our era when at least it seems that there's no longer Christendom? How in the world can you function if you're going to stick back with Wesley's arguments in their narrow sense? So you have to turn to his theology and look at either argument of prevenient grace or maybe a vocational calling arising out of justifying and sanctifying grace that leads Christians to participate in politics, because you're not getting it out of a Christianized society, because there isn't a Christianized society. So if his theological argument rests on that alone, if it really rests on the revolution of 1688, there's a problem with ever using him anywhere else. And Weber does say, by the way, that how Wesley understood politics was its prima facie, if I can use that phrase, it's prima facie monarchy. It's not necessarily monarchy. It really depends upon the social circumstances of the nation state in which one lives. I think that's what Weber's arguing. But if we don't come up with a Wesleyan argument that's independent of his actual application, we're going to be lost because we don't live under a king. I mean, that's that. And we don't even live in Christendom anymore in the United States.
Moving towards conclusion, why, when we discuss Wesleyan political theology, are we essentially almost confined to Ted Weber's book? Why isn't there more of a Wesleyan school of thought on this topic? Why is almost all Protestant political theology from the Reform side of the equation and not from the Wesleyan side? What's lacking in our tradition that it hasn't produced more resources?
Let me toss one thing out real quickly, and then I'll back off and listen to these better scholars. But the historical move of Methodism was toward perfectionism in society in the United States. It was not just individual perfectionism. It really had this, we can perfect the nation state. And in your article, for instance, Mark, you did mention the what was euphemistically called the temperance movement, the abstinence movement. And that's why that building is located there by the Capitol and by the Supreme Court, because those folks really thought they could change the society at its roots. I mean, right down to its foundation. That failed. And then what happened, what came into its place was an absurd concession to whatever the zeitgeist was. I mean, at the Board of Church and Society, at least in the United Methodist form. And it was utterly ineffective, and certainly didn't speak for the people who were attending those churches that were called United Methodist. So the reason we got to where we got to is because of organizational failure. And that's not even counting the stunning organizational failure of Methodist churches in the South in the antebellum period that tolerated slavery. So, I mean, we failed a number of times historically. And part of that was we really do have to get back to, I think, Wesley's theology, not his politics, if we're going to have a Wesleyan political theology.
Steve, your final thoughts?
Wow. I think Methodists have been better at producing activists than theorists. And Weber essentially says, he doesn't talk about the legacy necessarily, but that's still the kind of the issue that we face in Methodism. We have activists, not really theorists. And I think on the theological side, where the political theology and the theory could really germinate and develop, I think Methodism got caught up in historical movements, intellectual historical movements that led us away from Wesley. And I think in some ways, we're still trying to find our way back. There's been a lot of good work on Wesley's theology, but this is one of those areas where there just hasn't been the attention given, because attention has been given elsewhere. And it really should be the next step. And let me throw in one thought that may really seem like a left field kind of thing, but I wonder if we don't see more of Wesley's political theology that could be worth looking at from this particular angle in the structures of Methodism, right? It's sort of political theology worked out in the ecclesiology of the movement, right? And that's where the evangelical, egalitarian, Arminianism really starts to show up, with people being developed from within to take these leadership roles. That looks a lot less Calvinist, when we start looking at the people who take these roles and who exercise leadership in the movement. But back to the point, I think the Methodist activism on the one side and just the historical circumstances, our scholars, our thinkers about these kinds of things grew up in generations already swept up by other larger intellectual forces, liberalism, the social gospel movement, et cetera, that this aspect of Wesley's thinking just hasn't been looked at carefully yet.
Jason Vickers, your final thoughts.
Yeah, so I think one possibility for why Weber is one of the only resources we've produced and so forth, why Wesleyans haven't been more engaged in political theology, has to do with the locus of divine action for most Wesleyans. Namely, it's in the interior life, it's in the human heart. This is our pietist heritage that is shared by conservatives and liberals alike. I'm thinking here classical liberal types, right? The divine action that happens, that takes place in the human heart, the difference between conservatives and liberals is just it's telos, right? On the sort of conservative evangelical version of it, one form of that, I'm very well aware of Dayton and Don Dayton and so forth, and there's an activist side to the conservative wing of it, but it can just be a matter of one's personal salvation, right? The liberal side would tend to push it more in terms of advocacy for justice in society and so on. What neither, I think, have been particularly good at is thinking about structures, political structures, offices as being modes or locations of divine action. So that now I'm going to come back to Weber and to Wesley. So whatever we make of monarchy doesn't matter. Of the English Constitution, it doesn't matter. If you're American, you're not under these things. But the point here is that for Wesley, these were given by God. They were locations of divine action, and in some sense, I would argue almost revelatory in very specific ways. Not of say Christ and salvation, but in terms of positive law and so on. But the point is that they are of God. They are extensions of divine providence. So that it's not just the human heart that's the location of divine action. I think that might have something to do. Those are all big broad strokes, right? But that might have something to do with why we haven't instinctively done much in political theology. We believe that you don't change the world by getting, the levers of power, that sort of thing, but rather through conversion, through heart purity. And I think there's a conservative and a liberal form of that that's just left us more often than not uninterested in politics as such. Catholics are much better at this, by the way, right? There's a reason why they have a supermajority on the Supreme Court, right? Listen, evangelicals, Reformed maybe evangelicals get noisy, Baptists get noisy, other people get noisy about, controlling the White House, right? Catholics are far more savvy on this. They're much more well thought out. They understand what the key structures are. And they've been at work for a very long time, getting into position to, let's just say, leverage those structures on behalf of the Catholic faith and in their view, for the good of the world.
Dale and Ryan, your final thoughts.
Ryan, you want to go first, or?
Oh, either way, I'll just say, I mean, I agree with everything that's said. I think the pietistic nature of Methodism has kept it away from political theology. I think it's also difficult to try to, we go back and we think, oh, I need to translate Wesley into the contemporary situation, and that's hard to do. So I think that those are some of the reasons. I mean, we also, Methodism doesn't seem to produce a lot of ethicists. We have one of the very few on this call. And that's, so it's, for some reason, despite being a holiness movement, we haven't produced a lot of ethicists, which is really kind of strange. I will say this real fast, but I think Wesley does provide us with something that's really helpful in his own historical context. He says, your politics needs to be based on your theology, not the other way around. And we can take that message to today very easily without getting entangled in his monarchicalism.
So I would just, a lot of the reasons for me would be historical. Although I think I like the theological connections he was making there. The moment Methodism kind of gets to the place where it could, the American Revolution happens, and it can't, right? So, I mean, I think the historical events that required Methodism to become disestablishment and nonconformist meant that it was going to take a long time. And global Methodism, by and large, is shaped more by the nonconformists. It's not British Methodism going in. It's you know, a lot of Methodism in Africa is not just is AME, Methodist Episcopal. It's coming from the U.S. in other words, moving into Africa. If you look at the missions and things like that, so it's nonconformity and trying to square that with what we've been talking about here. That's number one. Number two, Methodism has never, or Wesleyanism, I should say, has never been in a situation after Wesley where we're connected to a state church and we're concerned about what it means to govern that way. Catholicism, from the moment Constantine steps on the scene, they're concerned with this, right? You've got centuries of trying to figure that out. They're concerned with this with the development of Europe, right? You've got centuries. We don't have anything like that. The Reformed wing, right? Scotland, you know, the Netherlands, they're, you know, South Africa. Sometimes, you know, one of the things I always want to point out to my Reformed brothers and sisters is that, you know, South Africa is a pretty bad experiment in Reformed theology. So, I mean, but they have we never had a situation where we are concerned about a state church, and therefore we got to figure out a political theology to. The third thing I would say is you don't have a Wesleyan movement outside of Methodism really until about the 1940s fully, where you can talk robustly about a Wesleyan movement beyond Methodism, where Pentecostalism is large enough that it could be robust, where the holiness churches that come out in between 1880 and 1900 are robust, right? I think the one place where Methodism, the Methodist Episcopal Church, could have done something, but it didn't because historical factors were working against it, was in the 1890s, where you finally have a Methodist in the White House and you can begin to think maybe we're sort of in this position of establishment, but at that moment, everything is fracturing and fragmenting and liberalism is taking root and personalism, you know, and all of those sorts of things, all that's unfolding. You know, the last thing I'll say is this. While you can't talk about a robust Wesleyan movement until around 1940, you can't even begin to talk about any of us thinking consciously of ourselves as Wesleyans first before, let's say, 1980. Thank God Don Dayton decided, I need to get the Pentecostals to have a conversation with the holiness folks because they're the same, and I need to get the Methodists involved, and I need to do this through the Wesleyan Theological Society and the Society of Pentecostal Studies in the early 70s when they don't want to talk to each other, or even be in the same room together, because we probably wouldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for Dayton trying to push, pull, prod in the 1970s to get us all together so that we can even begin to think of ourselves in a common way. I mean, and given that we're all searching for other paradigms sometimes. I mean, certainly for us in the Pentecostal side, we flirted too often with Reformed paradigms because we were not in touch with our Wesleyanism beyond entire sanctification, which wasn't even Wesley, it was E.B. Palmer. So, I mean, those are the historical reasons I think you could give for why we have not articulated a full-orbed political theology. I'd say it's there. We just have to articulate it more clearly, and that's what Weber was trying to help us see.
Mark, do I have time to jump in real quick on what he just said, on what Dale said?
30 seconds.
Okay, it's not as though there's a lack of, at least in the American context, there's not a lack of Methodist on school boards, okay? So let's start there. I think maybe a slightly different argument or something to add to this is that perhaps Methodists in the American context have bought into somewhere along the way the privatization of religion, right? So that we're not interested in foisting our Methodism upon the world, right? Our Methodism is what we do in Sunday school. We'll be on the school board, but we're not going to tell people what they should believe or how they should think about God or any of the rest. Contrast that with something like Catholic integralism, Mark. Right, that, in other words, Methodists aren't interested in running the world. We just want to save people's souls.
On that note, Jason Vickers, Jim Thobabins, Stephen Rankin, Ryan Danker, Dale Coulter, thank you for this very interesting conversation. Clearly, a new book on transforming Wesleyan political ethics needs to be written. Maybe the 5 of you can do it in the coming year. This is not the end, but the beginning of this conversation on Wesleyan political theology. Thank you so much. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.